We will have a live session before each of your 3 tests this semester. By the way, there is no midterm and there is no cumulative final at the end of the semester. There is just a unit test after each of the 3 units that we cover during this summer term. The second unit review will also cover the research paper that will be assigned around that time. Please be aware, speaking of papers, that you'll have 2 this semester, and the first one is introduced in next week's folder, which is already open to you. It's a literary analysis paper. The folder in the, I believe it's week 6, overall folder contains the guidelines that explains the particular paper, the literary analysis, 2 videos, and some additional information in a Dropbox that you can upload your paper to it. So please look over that information. The final version is due July 5th. Since July 4th is on a Monday, you have until that Tuesday. It is up to you, optional, if you want to email me a draft version of that paper by Thursday, the previous Thursday, which I believe is June 30th. I'll be glad to take a look at it and give you some quick feedback. But that's optional. That's your choice. All right, so we're going to begin. I want to talk about the test format. We're going to follow the same format for each of your 3 tests throughout the semester. A lot of times students, I'm trying to sort of give you an idea of what to expect, and once you have a feel for how the tests are organized, then you should be more comfortable with the test. Please be aware that I do not reset tests, and you cannot take it late unless there's a verifiable emergency that kept you from taking the test in that period in which it's open, which actually begins tomorrow morning, Friday at 8 o'clock, and will remain open until Tuesday night, because Monday is a holiday, Juneteenth, and so the school is closed at that time, and none of your assignments are due at that time. So you have until Tuesday to complete the test. It is timed. It's 90 minutes. I don't extend time unless you have a verifiable disability of some type, and I received the accommodation form from our accessibilities director or coordinator. All right, so please be aware that's the only reason that time is ever extended. I give this very same test to students in a classroom, and if the class meets face to face, and they have 15 minutes less time than you do. So I'm just allowing for the fact that you have to type, and sometimes that takes some students longer than others, and so I'm allowing 15 additional minutes on this same test. Okay, now the works that will be covered are these 5, which is what we've covered in the first term. I realize that in this folder, the week 5 folder, we begin unit 2, but that particular short story, Neighbor Rozicki, will be part of the Unit 2 testing information later this semester. Please be aware that you do need to know the literary concepts that we've covered this semester. Most of them were contained in YouTube video, in PowerPoint videos, in addition to some of your reading assignments. And there's a section of the test in which you will just simply match the term to its definition, and those are 1-point questions. Again, you have 90 minutes. The test is automatically submitted at the end of that 90 minutes. So there are a couple of ways to approach this. If I were taking this test, I would do it in one of 2 ways. You can certainly start at the beginning, and those are the 1-point questions. Do not waste time on those. If you don't know something, skip it or guess and then come back to it later, because the weightier questions are in the latter part of the test. So when you get to questions where you have to actually type more, and the final question is an essay question, that's going to take more time, that's going to take more thought, and so you don't want to waste a lot of time trying to look up 1-point questions. You are, by the way, allowed to use the short stories. You're allowed to use any material such as the PowerPoints that I provide for you. However, and I have to say this, I have students who will look up answers online and copy and paste, or else look up an answer and then reword it and put it in there. All it takes is one of those and you fail the entire test. Okay, that's cheating. you're not allowed to actually look up answers online, okay? So please be aware of that because it happens every semester. But so back to approaches to taking the test. One of the things that one of the values of beginning at the with the smaller questions, true, false, multiple choice, matching, and then working your way up, is that sometimes it will help fill in those small details so that by the time you get to the more theoretical, analytical questions at the latter part of the test, you've already kind of sort of covered some background. It's almost like a review. The other option is to start at the end and work backward. So because you can move back and forth in the test, so you can actually start with the essay question or with the significant passages and then work backward to the 1-point questions, okay? And again, here's the structure. It's going to be the same for all 3 tests. There's a section of true, false questions and multiple choice. They're 1 point each, so there are 20 of them, so that's 20 total points. Matching, 1 point each, so that's 10. Short answer, it actually varies as to the point totals for each question. Please be sure and follow the guidelines. If it says list, then you don't have to write complete sentences. If the question says and complete sentences explain, in that case you do, and it will count off if you don't follow the instructions. Always slow down enough to read the instructions. I frequently have students who do not do that and who end up with grades that are not what they would hope. Now this next section, significant passages, let me tell you a few things about this. I've pulled out 8 different sets of lines from the different works that you've read this semester. And what you will need to do is to tell me who the speaker is. Now notice speaker, not writer. We're not talking about the author. We're not talking about Mark Twain, okay? I'm asking who's doing the talking here in the story itself. Then you identify what the work is, you know, Luck of Roaring Camp or whatever the title of the piece is. And then you explain the significance. Why are these lines important to what happens overall in the particular story? That doesn't mean just reword what it says in other words. A lot of students miss, and this part is 3 points. So it's 1 point for the speaker, 1 point for the work, and then 3 points for explaining the significance of the passage. How is it tied to the overall plot? What happens? How is it tied to the theme, which is the main idea? If you simply just reword what it says, in other words, this passage is saying you can't receive 3 points for that, okay? Because you have failed to actually answer the question. Now, I provide 8 different sets of lines. You only need to choose 4 of those. Please do not do all of them. Sometimes I have students who are so confident in their abilities, they want to show me that they know everything, so they answer all 8. The reality is I don't have time when I'm grading to grade all of that much, so I just grade the first 4. So it's just a waste of your time, okay? So choose the 4 passages that you feel most comfortable with and answer the questions. And then finally, you have a short essay response. Now, this is where students often make a mistake again. I give you a choice of 3 different topics. Do not please write about all 3, because what happens is you end up with a diluted response. You can't fully develop something when you're trying to cover 3 very broad essay questions, okay? So only write about one of them, but it's fine if you use, I mean, you do need to use your books. You do need to use detail here. You do need to answer the one question you choose thoroughly. And notice that's a third of the test, almost a third of the test grade, okay? So this information pretty much tells you what I've just said. Please notice that even though a lot of times students, because I allow you to use your books and notes, any notes that you've taken and other materials that I provide in the lessons, they feel like they don't have to study. That is not true. You will run out of time. You do need to study in advance. If I were taking this, I would have the stories open. I would have a list of those terms, you know, realism and naturalism and so forth, and a definition next to it. I would be prepared in that way so it does not slow you down, okay? Be sure and look back over my responses. I'll make sure that all of the discussion boards are open. Everything that I've gotten to this point has been graded. So be sure and look at my responses to what you wrote as well as what other students wrote, especially on with the Daisy Miller piece that you just submitted work this past week. There were some excellent responses to those questions. And so I think it would be very helpful to you to go back and read what other students wrote as well. Okay, so we're going to move on from that, and I want to do now a review of the materials in Unit 1. Before we do this, of course, one of the key characteristics, if you read the introduction to this section in the textbook, the online textbook, one of the key characteristics of all of the works that you've read is that they fall within the literary genre called realism. And so I'm just going to pull out this passage really quickly talking about realism from your textbook. All writers in the realistic mode shared a commitment to referential narrative. Their readers expected to meet characters that resembled ordinary people, often in the middle class, living in ordinary circumstances, who experienced plausible real-life struggles and who often, as in life, were unable to find resolution to their conflicts. Realists developed these characters by using ordinary speech and dialogue, commensurate to the character's social class. Often in realistic stories, characterization and plot become intertwined. Especially think about, for example, the Notorious Jumping Frog of Calaveras County. That's less a developed story with a plot to it, and it has more to do with characterization, of making this character, Jim Smiley, come to life. In other words, character often drove the plot of the stories. Characters in realistic fiction were three-dimensional, and their inner lives were often revealed through an objective, omniscient narrator, such as in The Luck of Roaring Camp. So we're going to start here with a few notes about The Luck of Roaring Camp. The setting is really important in this particular piece because it's set in this valley. It's a mining town. It's somewhat isolated. It's a very rugged location that attracted rugged people, rugged men especially, because of course there's only one woman mentioned, and she dies at the very beginning of the story. And it takes place during the 1850s gold rush. Now, you know, the fact that the setting's crucial for a variety of reasons. First of all, because the men are isolated from the rest of the world. As a matter of fact, the Roaring Camp was referred to as a city of refuge at one point, I think on the second page of the story. And a city of refuge is actually a biblical allusion, and we'll talk about allusion in a second. But a city of refuge in the Bible, in the Old Testament, was a place where people who had committed a crime could go, and it was a designated city of refuge where you could not take vengeance on them. Okay, so this place attracted a lot of people running from a variety of things, including the law, right? And also, the setting is important because, of course, at the very end, you have this almost biblical epic flood that washes the town away, and of course, with it, both Luck and Kentuck. The title, of course, is ironic because what is Lucky about? I mean, in you know, they named the baby Thomas Luck, but then, of course, how lucky is it that he doesn't survive very long? So there is ironic there. There is irony there. He does indeed change these men. He has this impact on them, quite humorous, really. And then, of course, the story ends. Now, often students become confused because this is a story. I understand the language is really difficult, especially in these early stories. It almost takes some unpacking where you have to kind of slow down. But the story is full of irony. And, you know, we've had several pieces about irony. And, of course, when you read the yellow wallpaper, you were supposed to discuss irony in the discussion board. And so the humor of this piece hinges on the irony here. As a matter of fact, to just give you a brief sort of overview of Thomas Crane and Bret Harte. Harte was a literary pioneer in his use of local color for bringing California and Western subjects to the readers in the East. And part of what he contributed by kind of fleshing out these characters and making them contradictory and a little bit more complex than just, you know, the dangerous villain and the prostitute with the heart of gold. And he didn't do that. He made more complex characters. And the irony is part of what also adds to the complexity. So they're not, the characters themselves are not traditional stock characters. They're far more complex and dynamic. I'm just going to read one passage for you from the story. The assemblage numbered about 100 men. Of course, these are all men who are in this bar, right? One or two of these were actual fugitives from justice. Some were criminal, and all were reckless. Physically, they exhibited no indication of their past lives and character. The greatest scamp had a Raphael face. I'm going to show you what that means in just a second, but Raphael face, that is an artistic illusion. And an illusion is a reference to either something biblical, something literary, something from classical mythology, or let's see, what's the fourth one? Or something or someone historical. And the assumption, the writer doesn't explain it for the reader. The writer just assumes that the reader is going to understand it. The greatest scamp had a Raphael face with a profusion of blonde hair. Oakhurst, a gambler, had a melancholy air and intellectual abstraction of Hamlet. Now, Hamlet, of course, if you ever read that Shakespearean play, that is a literary allusion. And the assumption, the thing about Hamlet was Hamlet couldn't make a decision. And here it's talking about how the gambler himself was very much like a Hamlet figure who just was sort of disconnected. Instead of, you know, if you think about Westerns, if you've ever watched any older, even some of the new Westerns, you know, the characters oftentimes are almost two-dimensional. They're kind of flat characters. They all behave the same way. And so what this paragraph is trying to show very humorously is how these characters differ. The coolest and most courageous man was scarcely over 5 feet in height, with a soft voice and an embarrassed, timid manner. The term roughs applied to them was a distinction rather than a definition. Perhaps in the minor details of fingers, toes, ears, etc., the camp may have been deficient, but these slight omissions did not detract from their aggregate force. The strongest man had but 3 fingers on his right hand. The best shot had but 1 eye. And all of this characterization is just supposed to be humorous, but also to sort of develop a bit more the complexity of these different men who ultimately were impacted by the birth of this child. Now, a classical illusion is, of course, mythological, and there's a point at which, when Luck is born, they try to decide what to do with him, and they decide that Stumpy should be his father, because it was rumored that Stumpy had 2 families. He was a bigamist, and that he literally was running from the law. That's illegal, you know, to be married to 2 different women, and so that's the reason Stumpy became the quote-unquote father to Luck, is because, you know, well, he was a father to a lot of kids. That's, of course, supposed to be humorous. And then the classical illusion was that his mother was an ass, right, who was producing milk. But the reference there was to Romulus and Remus. If you know your classical mythology, Romulus and Remus were twins who were born, they were demigods, I believe. So I think their father or their mother one was a god, but they were one of them was rumored to found a great city, which of course became Rome. Rome was named after Romulus. And the twins, because of this prediction, were exposed. In other words, whoever was in power did not want these 2 twins to survive. So exposure was a way in which you left it up to the gods as to whether children would survive or not. So you just took them out and abandoned them in the elements. And so quite famously, Romulus and Remus survived because a she-wolf who was lactating, had cubs, was feeding them. And so just to show you this this idea. This is a very famous sculpture of Romulus, Remus, and the she-wolf. This will take just a second to pull up. And of course, this sculpture is, I don't know if it's in Rome or not, but it's very famous. There was that reference to the Raphael painting, this character who, the greatest scamp, you know, someone who just literally could not be trusted, had the face of a Raphael painting. Well, Raphael, just to give you, very soft, very famous painter, I believe, during the Renaissance. So just to give you a picture of what that looked like. So, you know, it's not the face of a scamp. That's not the face of someone that you would think. And that's, again, an artistic illusion there. So back to the PowerPoint. Biblical, of course, I mentioned the city of refuge is a biblical idea, and then primal curse. It mentioned that Cherokee Sal was undergoing the primal curse, and of course that's with the fall and the Genesis story, where part of the curse on Eve was that she would have children and there'd be pain in childbirth. And so it mentions primal curse, you know, referring to Cherokee Sal and the pain that she was in. Then, of course, the literary allusions include things like the reference to Hamlet. I think the story itself is pretty straightforward. It's honestly, I find parts of it laugh out loud funny. Even, you know, though the ending is quite bittersweet, this whole idea of Kentuck going on with luck, you know, to heaven is the idea. But this little baby coming in and totally changing things, you know, it was a very original idea at the time. And moving on now to the notorious jumping frog of Calaveras County. A couple of things to note. One is, I noticed in the discussion board, several of you mentioned, you know, these are Southerners. Calaveras County's in California, right? So again, this is another gold rush town, people who lived there. And so when you're talking about Simon Wheeler, who's the internal narrator, we'll discuss that in a second. But Calaveras County, they actually still in California have a jumping frog. They have a big festival and they have a jumping frog contest. As a matter of fact, you can get on YouTube and their videos there almost every year of when they held this jumping frog contest in honor of this short story that was named after their county. So just a note about that. It's an area settled by miners. Now, this particular story is told using what's called a frame narrative. And so let me illustrate what that looks like. It's a story within a story, so that you've got your external narrator, and he's only identified as a gentleman from the East, right? Who has, sorry about my drawing, but so the external narration is from a gentleman from the East. He's never named, and he actually serves as a contrast to Simon Wheeler, who is this big storyteller that this guy gets sort of trapped listening to after he asks about Leonidas Smiley. Now, Leonidas Smiley and Jim Smiley are not the same person. All that Simon Wheeler hears is the name Wheeler, the name Smiley, and he just goes off and starts telling tale after tale after tale. As a matter of fact, again, this if you were going to plot as we're going to with to build a fire, if you're actually going to chart the plot elements of this story, it really does not rise. There is some rise to some climax, which is when, of course, the frog won't jump, but it really does not necessarily have a big theme, or it's almost more like the old folk tales or tall tales that you tell about someone, because of course so much of it's exaggeration, and it's supposed to be humorous. So the external narrator is this gentleman from the East who actually serves in contract. We know he's educated, we know he's visiting West, and he runs into this internal narrator who is Simon Wheeler. And Simon Wheeler is the gentleman who tells the stories about Jim Smiley and Jim Smiley's gambling addiction. You know, the guy would gamble on anything if somebody's wife was going to, if the preacher's wife was going to survive. I mean, all of that is supposed to, of course, be humorous. And then we get down to, the story about the horse with no hind legs. And and then of course we get to Daniel Webster, who is the frog that ends up loaded with buckshot and loses Jim Smiley all that money. So there's really no moral to the story. Gambling's bad, or that really was never Twain's intention. He just captured a piece of Americana, of what life was like in this mining area, kind of rough and ready idea. And there are several allusions. We mentioned allusions before. There are two historical allusions. And again, allusions are references to, in this case, historical figures that are not explained. There's just an assumption that the reader will understand the reference here. So we've got Daniel Webster, and then and Daniel Webster was actually named after an 18th century statesman, American statesman. He was a lawyer. He actually argued before the Supreme Court more than 200 cases. The guy was known as this amazing orator, amazing debater, and very intelligent, very skilled. And so yeah, I think he successfully argued most of those 200 cases. There was even a short story written about him, called The Devil and Daniel Webster, where some gentleman had, sold his soul to the devil at a crossroads, if you know those sort of crossroads legends. And so when the devil came to collect, instead he met up with Daniel Webster, who was there to defend the guy very successfully, and he could keep his soul. So, kind of indication of the skills of this particular man. And so to name a frog Daniel Webster, you can see that it's sort of idea of elevating him to this sort of superior position. Andrew Jackson was the 7th president. He is now very controversial, sort of a love him or hate him kind of thing, especially because of the Trail of Tears and his involvement with the Indian removal, quote unquote, Indian removal solution, which is how so many Native Americans ended up on reservations and so many broken promises and so forth. But he also was considered a hero to some. And his nickname was Old Hickory. I think it was also Rough and Ready. No, that was Teddy Roosevelt. Never mind. But Andrew Jackson, so you had this horse too that, Andrew Jackson was like on the White House lawn. I believe that he got in a duel with someone. There's just legends about the guy. And so, of course, when you name this lame horse after him, it's kind of like this unexpected success, because Andrew Jackson actually was not that well educated. He was sort of self-taught, a self-taught politician, self-taught lawyer, and but he unexpectedly won. So it's that kind of idea. And just like in, even more so than in the Lackawanna camp, there's so much local color, which creates the feel of a place in the dialogue, the way people talk, and in the description of the characters. All right, we're going to move to build a fire. To build a fire is pretty straightforward. The character who is, I provided some information about hypothermia. I provided some information about the Klondike Gold Rush. And this particular character, hubris is his downfall, and hubris is excessive pride. If you look back through the story, I hope you did more than just watch the video, because you're going to miss a lot if you just watch the video. But this particular character keeps referring back to the old timer and the old timer's advice and how the old timer was trying to train him what to prepare, what to do. And so much of it had to do with how to stay alive. I don't know, I've gotten sort of hooked on, I've had students when they did their discussion boards in the past and they mentioned the series Alone on National Geographic. Well, I've kind of gotten hooked on those. These people are just dropped off. They're entirely alone. They can take 10 items and they try and survive, see who can survive the longest. And so this guy thought he was prepared and was totally unprepared. And throughout the story, there is a juxtaposition, and juxtaposition is a great literary term. And what it means is you take two things and you put them side by side for a basis of comparison. So in this case, you have the dog that accompanies him. It's not his dog, but it's accompanying him because it sort of trusts that the human's going to have food, fire, and that they're on their way to a particular place. So the dog reacts out of instinct and kind of base knowledge versus the man who is using his intellect, but unfortunately his intellect is not informed by experience or imagination. So he just is going on his own raw intelligence, but it's not really based on anything, right? So that juxtaposition between the dog and the man is pretty important because what it's trying to show is how the animal knows that the conditions are dangerous and responds to sort of stay alive. And the implication is, it carries on after the man is dying of hypothermia. And the man is making decision after decision, some right, some wrong, and some of it's just bad luck. But he should have never started out to begin with. And anything over minus 50 degrees, the old timer told him, you have to go with somebody else or you're in danger. And he just didn't listen to him. And you can see throughout the story as events happen to him, the man, he responds by reacting to the old timer. Oh, maybe the old timer is right. Oh, and then something will happen. He'll go, no, see, I can handle this. Until finally, the actual climax of this, so the exposition, when you're talking about plot, and hopefully you learned this in English 1101 if you took it, but if not, maybe high school. The exposition means the introduction. Now, it doesn't just mean the first paragraph. Sometimes they're expositions that last pages before you get to the rising action. An exposition is everything that sets up. It establishes the characters, it establishes the setting, the situation, and then when you have the first complication, that starts the rising action. And the complication is the first conflict. And of course, the first conflict is when the guy falls through the water and has to build a fire. And so that starts the rising action. And then after that, it's just everything goes wrong. Leading up to the crisis is the next to worst point, okay? And the crisis for this guy is essentially when all the matches, he lights all of the matches, and of course, it's burning his hand, and eventually he has to and he can't feel anything in his hand, he has to put it out. And that leads to the climax when he has no other way to get warm. Now, attempting to kill the dog, which is, most of us would shrink from that idea. I'm sure all of us would, but, to try and keep warm. I mean, he doesn't, that's already too late. The climax is the point of greatest tension. Crisis is high tension, climax is greatest tension. He still tries to do some things. He tries to run. Okay, that doesn't work. He grabs the dog, but he has no way of doing it. His fingers and his hands are freezing, and he cannot do. They're useless. There's nothing he can do with it. So it's already too late. So at the point at which he has no chance of having a fire, that's when everything's over. Okay. And so that the following action again is him attempting to run, kind of panicking, him attempting to grab the dog, not being able to do much of anything there. And then the denouement does mean ending. Now, his epiphany, and an epiphany for a character is that sudden recognition, is that aha moment. Where they suddenly see what the problem is, what their error is. And of course, for him, it's when he says the old timer was right. That's the epiphany. Again, it's a good plot term. if you've ever heard it before. It's actually a religious term. An epiphany is an aha moment. It's a a sudden revelation. And for this man, the epiphany is the old timer was right. And then denouement is a French term that simply means the conclusion, the ending. And it sort of wraps up with him freezing to death. Your discussion board actually had to do with kind of the deeper meaning that that the author was trying to convey through this story, having to do with the type of people who are pulled to this adventurous spirit, who often didn't have the skills to actually and how nature, of course, it's an example of naturalism, and how nature basically is immutable. It doesn't care, and there are people who wander into it unprepared and ultimately do not survive. All right, Daisy Miller was a lengthier reading assignment, and a little bit about Daisy Miller. This was a reading in your textbook in case you didn't see it. It's the last part of Henry James, who's the author. It's the last paragraph in the section about his biography. This is called Daisy Miller's a novella, which means a short novel, okay, that focuses on a young, independent-minded American girl traveling abroad with her mother and brother in Europe, who meets an American living abroad, Friedrich Winterbourne. Her interactions with Winterbourne provide an examination of ways in which Daisy is viewed by those acclimated to European manners and unwritten rules of, notice that's unwritten rules of etiquette and behavior for young women. Winterbourne's obsessive desire to understand whether or not Daisy is innocent, quote unquote, provides much of the plot of the story. He cannot determine, for example, whether she is a playful young girl, simply ignorant of the cultural conventions of place and time, or whether she is more worldly and manipulative than meets the eye. Winterbourne himself becomes a psychological study. So it's not just Daisy who's studied in this piece. It says as much about Winterbourne as it does her. Is his preoccupations with Daisy's innocence a reflection of his own inhibitions? Is he living essentially a half-life, unable or unwilling to commit fully to another person? Is he paralyzed in a complex web of social or psychological fears? In characteristic realist style, James offers no resolution, and that's one of the essences of realism. It doesn't necessarily tie the stories up in a nice little bow, right? And the moral of the story is, I mean, sometimes the endings are not what you expect, or they're they don't necessarily end and they lived happily ever after. Allowing questions about Daisy's character and Winterbourne's future to go unanswered. Now, this story is an example, it juxtaposes, to use that word again, the nouveau riche versus Europeanized Americans, expatriates, if you will. The term expatriate basically means an American citizen living abroad, usually in Europe. Nouveau riche is a French term that means newly rich. And Daisy, the Millers, this takes place during the Gilded Age, which essentially was the turn of the century into the 20th century, where a lot of people like the Carnegies, the Mellons, the Rockefellers made their fortunes with the Industrial Revolution on steel and automobiles and railway and a variety of other enterprises, and they just became terribly wealthy, still are terribly wealthy. So they are newly rich. So they don't have, versus in Europe, there are families that are practically aristocratic Europeans who are old money. So it's sort of old money versus new money. And the idea here, we know Daisy's father, who is not traveling with them, is a banker. And we also know that probably they are newly rich. They don't understand how one would behave. They don't have the background in that. They don't understand. And of course, America would be quite different in its expectations, although women, of course, were still not supposed to be, were proper young ladies, were not supposed to be alone with men. And so there were codes of conduct. It's just probably Daisy didn't pay attention to that anyway. So when they get to Europe to do this tour, right, and they're traveling abroad, they've got the money to do it. The father doesn't come with them. A couple of things that we know: the father, is absent, and the mother is ineffectual. She is not. She has no. Her kids have free reign. Daisy's brother Frederick is all over the place. Randolph. He's loud. He's garish. Um, he brags. He's, is allowed to eat whatever sugar he wants to. He runs wild. And Daisy, of course, is allowed. She can look the part because she's got the finest dresses and she looks like she belongs there. But the reality is she doesn't have an understanding of or background, nor does she care that there are certain ways that someone should behave and there's certain ways they shouldn't. Now, it doesn't mean that those shoulds and shouldn'ts are correct or should be followed necessarily. They're obviously restrictive, but at the same time, that's part of what attracts Winterbourne's attracted to is her flaunting of these conventions, but he's also afraid of it because it's kind of like, well, she just trashy, Now we have, as was mentioned before, Winterbourne is, the story is as much about him and kind of in his brain, and in many ways he represents Henry Miller, not Henry Miller, he represents the author, Henry James, because James, we know, he traveled to Europe quite a bit. As a matter of fact, he preferred Europe in a lot of respects to what was happening in America at the time. But he was an observer. As a matter of fact, his brother William James was one of the founders of psychiatry, and so this idea of just sort of sitting and watching, and the story is actually based on a real event, where of a story that happened to a young American girl. Different name, of course, and James heard about it, and then he just sort of fictionalized it and played around with the ideas. In this case, we don't know, can we trust what Daisy sort of filtered through Winterbourne's imagination through what he says about her, and that's what we as readers know, and we kind of respond based on what Winterbourne says until the point where you start thinking, well, is Winterbourne all that great? We know he's hypocritical, because he definitely was willing to be alone with Daisy, and he took her to the castle of Chalons, right, for example. But then he, complains about other young men. We know he's jealous of Giovanelli, the Italian. We know that he's having some type of, or there are rumors, because the story starts and ends the same way. Winterbourne goes back to Geneva, where he was before. He picks up again with this woman who is evidently married. So he's not the most reputable person himself, and so there's kind of these indications that he's hypocritical in his in his ideas about toward Daisy and his opinions of her. The story forces the reader to kind of make meaning of it all. Some things about characterization here. We know Daisy, for example, changes her name from Annie to Daisy, but the thing about daisies, most of them, they're kind of common flowers, right? They're white, they don't last a long time if you cut them. They're very fresh and they're very beautiful in some ways, and then white daisies, of course, the ones that kind of grow almost like weeds, are very spring-like, and the whole idea of white being indicating innocence and so forth. And so this story really is about, trying to examine, why do people do what they do? Why does Daisy behave the way that she does? Well, we know that, for example, her parents, she has no guardrails. I mean, she's allowed to do whatever. Same with her brother Randolph. Winterbourne, Mrs. Walker and his aunt, Mrs. Costello, are all Americans, okay? They are not, but they are Europeanized Americans, which means that they have lived in Europe for so long that they basically have adopted European custom, European attitudes. And so a lot of the secondary characters, like Mrs. Costello and Eugenio, the courier who attends them, and so forth, are just there to reveal things about the primary characters. Finally, the yellow wallpaper. The rest cure was honestly a cure, quote unquote, for women's nervous disorders back at the turn of the century, into the 20th century. It literally was total bed rest, limited intellectual activity, limited physical activity, where someone was just, if some had a nervous disposition, or in this case depression, were just sent to bed. And when what may have been more helpful would have been to be out, exercise, walking, being around people. The author herself went through something similar, and she wrote wallpaper, and this is a direct quote, to save people from going crazy, like to expose this idea of, because of course that is what happens to the character in the story. She ends up, the woman behind the wallpaper is indeed her. And it's written as a series of note-like journal entries in which we sort of trace this madness as she continually, through what she reveals in these entries, loses a grip on reality. All right, so those are just some overviews. I didn't want this to run longer than 45 minutes. I do hope this is helpful. Please don't hesitate to email me should you have any questions.